everyone, welcome back to the channel, welcome back to another cooking video. Yes, it's finally time to start this up again. I know it's been way too long since I've made, well, really any video, but especially a cooking video. I did promise before that I'm going to start making more. So, without further ado, as I said, welcome back to the channel, welcome back to the cooking videos. And for today's cooking video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make some delicious pulled pork out of this massive hunk of pork shoulder I have here. So in a second, I'll point the camera down onto our workspace here, and I'll show you guys what I'm going to be using to create this, and then the steps involved in actually getting it from this big hunk of meat into some delicious pulled pork that we all know and love. So first things first, the ingredients that I'm going to be using for my dry rub and to make this big chunk of meat taste really good is I have a simple dry rub mix here, and in that dry rub is just kind of a custom homemade herb mix, just full of dry herbs, so thyme, oregano, basil, rosemary, and probably a couple other things in there that I forget at this time, but basically just a bunch of mixed dry herbs, which I just all blended together. I have this, which is the main thing, which is kind of a little smoky dry rub. I'm going to go for kind of like a herby smoked flavor on it. I have this little bit of a blackening rub just for some extra flavor and to give it some extra color. Just a simple little pinch of cinnamon, again, to help kind of with that sweeter flavor. And then just a little pinch of some sea salt. And to finish it off, some freshly ground black pepper. Don't need a lot, just a few turns in there. Get it all into a bowl. And take a spoon or a whisk or something. Just go ahead, mix that up until it's all nice and mixed together. And that's going to be for our dry rub there. And then for the searing in the pan, which is a step I'll explain a little bit later, I'm going to be using just some regular olive oil and a little bit of chipotle flavored oil, just for an extra little bit of a kick. And then also something which, again, I'll explain a little bit later, is I'm going to be using some, well, I'm not sure, maybe a bit of both, but either some Coke or some Pepsi, or really any of your favorite pop will work well, depending on what flavor you're going for. As I said, I'm kind of going for a sweet and smoky flavor, so something darker like the Coke or the Pepsi is going to work, but if you want maybe something lighter, you could also opt for, say, a ginger ale or Fanta or something if you wanted to go a bit on the lighter end or a bit fruity. But before we get to all that, we have to transform this into some smaller pieces so that we can get it to cook more evenly, and also check and make sure we remove some of the fat off the top, because we do want some fat in our cooking, but you know, a little bit too much on there is not a good thing. So I'm just going to go over to the sink, get this out, clean it up, and make sure all the blood and liquid is tapped off of it, and then I'll come back and show you how to remove the fat off of a pork shoulder. Alright guys, and one more quick note is that I'm preheating my oven here to balmy 300 degrees, because the name of the game for pulled pork is low and slow. We are going to pan sear it beforehand, which I'll explain in the video in just a few moments here, but yeah, make sure before you start all of that, you preheat your oven to 300 degrees. Alright guys, so I apologize that you can't see my face in this, but the focus is obviously going to be on the meat product down here. So nevertheless, as you can see here, I have it out of the bag. I've just patted it down, made sure there's no blood or anything that's going to run off of my board here as I go to cut it. And what we want to do now is take off all this fat off the top, because like I said, you want some fat on here, but all of this fat and essentially kind of skin of the pig is just going to be way too tough. Won't really break down during the cooking process. So we want to go ahead and remove it. So all I'm going to do is take my boning knife here, and just, luckily there's a bit of a seam on the end here. Hopefully you guys can see this okay. There's a bit of seam on the end here, and all I want to do is just lift up kind of this thicker skin, just gently get my knife under, and you'll see and feel it start to gently separate away from the meat. Now there is going to be some fat underneath there. Don't cut directly into that right now, because this is probably the good fat that we want to keep on this while cooking. If it looks like too much at the end of it, I'll go ahead and lightly trim some of that off, because again, like I said, we do want some fat on here, but too much is going to be hard to break down, and then your meat's going to taste really fatty, and it won't be that nice. And one thing I hadn't realized before when I picked this up is that this is actually a bone-in shoulder. Now, that doesn't really matter for the purposes of the recipe. This is going to work whether you have a big bone-in shoulder like this or just a little one to make, you know, for yourself on a Saturday night or whatever. The process is the same, except that this does give me a little bit of way, I guess, to kind of brag and show you guys the true meaning of fall off the bone with the slow cooking, and also having the bone in here to cook is just going to add some extra depth of flavor with having the bone still in there. So with that being said, as I said, you see I'm just gently lifting up and cutting right along. There's a fat line. I'm not sure if the camera's going to pick this up, but pretty much when you lift up the skin like this, you're going to see obviously the fat that you're holding and kind of this whiter fat right on top of the meat. You want to cut gently just on top of that white fat. Be careful not to cut into the meat. If you cut into the meat a little bit, it's not a huge deal, but you just want to gently cut it away, pull back like this. You're going to see it start to peel back like this. So I'm just going to continue to do that for this whole thing. I'm not going to bore you with the entire video because it's going to take me a couple minutes given the size of this, but that's the general way that you want to remove any type of fat off of any meat, especially something like pork or a big piece of beef. Now that you can see, I've trimmed off most of that really thick, stubborn fat. I've left a thin layer here, a little thicker in some places, because again, we do want some fat, but now this should be able to slow cook in the oven there and break down enough that we can at least pull it apart, and if there's any kind of floating fat later on, we can always just fish it out. So the only thing left now to do is just cut this monster piece into manageable pieces. Now this one might be a little bit tricky as I have a bone which runs pretty much right down the middle of it. So I'm just going to I'm going to basically just go on here, hack off some pieces that are a little bit smaller. If I need to trim them later, I'll go ahead. But yeah, just like that. You don't have to be nice with it, as again, you're just going to kind of slap it in the oven and slow cook it. So let's cut one piece off there, and I just have a pan here to throw the pieces on so we can do the marinade as well afterwards. So yeah, we're just going to kind of cut it down as best we can. Might even actually be able to get through the bone here, which will make life a little bit easier and more convenient. Maybe not. So the pork was fighting me a little bit there, but I managed to cut it down into some more manageable, smaller pieces. As you guys can see here, again, it's just much easier to work with, and they're also going to cook a lot more evenly once they're in the pan. So at this point, the only thing left to do, again, I have this just on a sheet pan here. I have my board for some overflow. And at this point, all we're going to do is grab our dry rub, which I mentioned at the beginning of this video. And we're just going to shake a little bit of it on here. Shake some onto our hand. Don't have to be really neat about this. Just kind of get that dry rub everywhere. Get a little bit to start. And then just start rubbing it all into the meat. Make sure you get as much coverage as you can. If you have a piece like this, which you can kind of open up, make sure you open it up, and you want to have nice full coverage. And then we're just going to let the meat sit for a couple minutes, not too long, but let it sit for a couple minutes. Let that dry rub flavor start to soak in just a little bit before we put it on our pan to pancer, and then eventually cook it in the oven. Alright guys, so it's been a couple minutes. The meat's just been left here to sit. I actually ended up putting a bit more dry rub on the top just for some extra flavor. So we have our pan that we're actually going to be cooking in the oven in. So I just have my big hotel pan here, just on a low heat. Oil's in there, you may be able to see it smoking. So all we got to do now is just get our pieces and put them in. And you're going to hear that sizzle, which is exactly what you want, because the whole point of pre-searing the meat is to lock in the flavor, get a nice little crust on it, and make sure all of our dry rub actually soaks in, so that when we put it, all the pieces in to slow cook it, all that flavor is locked in and can slowly start to cook out. So don't overcrowd it, just get a few pieces in at a time. You hear that sizzle. I'm actually going to turn my heat up a little bit now. So you want to hear that sizzle, you want to give it a couple minutes on each side, let it flip it over. Again, we're just looking for a nice browning, a nice little crust, again, to lock in the flavor. And then as they come out, we'll put them on the tray to rest, do all the pieces, put everything back in, and then we'll cover it up with the liquid. So these pieces aren't done yet, but you can see this is kind of what we're looking for. We want to get this nice brown coloring on it. If we come over to the ones that are already done, you can see here, they're not 100% cooked, but you can see the meat's all seared in, so all that flavor is locked in. There's not a lot of juice run off, but we're going to put all that back in once we're done with searing. So now that everything's got that light sear on it, I just went ahead and wiped out my pan a little bit, took out the excess oil. I'm going to put some of that oil back in because there's a ton of flavor in there, but I don't want it to be super oily, of course. So we're just going to go ahead and put our meat back into the pan. It's okay if they rest on top of each other a little bit. Again, they're all pretty much equal size, so they're all going to cook the same time, but again, try to fill in every little nook and cranny there. And then remember all that juice that came off the meat when we cooked it. We want to dump off as much of that in there as we can, because again, this is all flavor. And then I also added, I'm going to put some Worcestershire sauce in here just a little bit. It just, again, kicks up the flavor a little bit, gives it a bit more liquid so they don't burn during cooking. So just give a little splash of that. I would guess maybe about half a cup's worth of Worcestershire. And then we're going to go ahead, open our cans of pop. And you can use cans of pop if you have bottles, whatever you have laying around. You can use it. I'm going to use the Coke and the Pepsi. I don't want to start any Coke Pepsi wars out there, but this seems a bit sacrilegious. That was kind of the idea. But the whole point of putting the pop in here is that because it's carbonated, it's slightly acidic by nature, so that's going to help to break down the fibers in the meat to get it nice and tender. And then all that carbonation is going to cook off, and there's enough sugar in it that you're going to have that sweet and smoky flavor that I was mentioning earlier that I want to go for. So just put enough in there to, you don't want to fully cover the meat, but you want enough just so that you know you're not going to fully evaporate. So that's pretty much what you're going to look like at this point. We have, you can see our liquid is not quite covering, but it's up high enough. I'll put a little bit of water in there. Then all I'm going to do is cover this with some saran wrap and some foil. You always want to put the saran wrap on here first because you are going to be cooking it low and slow. So you don't want any of that tin foil to stick to the meat and maybe have some of the metal leach out. That doesn't look good, and obviously eating metal isn't that great for you. So always put that layer of saran wrap just to kind of protect the meat from any metal getting actually inside of it from the tin foil. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. We'll throw it in the oven, and then we're going to let it go for a couple hours. And once it's done, I'll come back and show you what we do afterwards in terms of pulling it and getting your pulled pork ready to go. So here's our final pan. Again, as I said, everything's in there. I ended up throwing a bay leaf in there just to give some extra depth of flavor as it cooks. But layer of saran wrap, layer of foil, make sure it's tighter on the edges so no heat escapes. Then we're going to go over here to our oven. We're going to stick it on any rack is fine. Stick it up there on the top rack and close her up. We're going to leave her for a couple hours. Now, one thing of note, you'll notice at the beginning of the video I said I was preheating my oven to 300 degrees, but you'll see it's currently at 290. Now, my oven's been a little bit wonky the last little while, and it hasn't been kind of heating up properly. So I managed to adjust the temperature a little bit, up 10 degrees, because it just wasn't coming to temp on a normal bake setting, which we have it on now. So it's one thing to keep in mind. If you can, I'm not sure if you guys will be able to see inside the oven there. No, probably not. But I do have a oven thermometer in there, which confirmed that the oven wasn't heating up the temp. So because I adjusted the temperature by 10 degrees in the oven settings, that's why I have it at 290 degrees. So that in reality, it is sitting at about 300. So just always keep that in mind. Always check your oven to make sure it's heating up the temp. And if you're ever not sure where the temperature is, if it's off, you're always better to go a little bit under and keep the product in for longer than go super high and have it cook thoroughly. Again, with pulled pork like this, you want to go low and slow, let that flavor build in there, let everything cook down slowly. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Always make sure your oven's working at proper temperature. If you need to get a service, get a service. If you can adjust it yourself, usually these ovens are pretty smart. You can adjust the temperature yourself, but just keep an eye on it. And again, low and slow is the name of the game. So we're going to keep this in here for a few hours. I'm not sure. When I come back later, I'll tell you how long it's been. Again, it's going to determine. I have a bit more meat in there than you guys at home probably would. So just factor it in. But usually for something like this, you want at least 3 to 4 hours on a low roast. At the end of it, it's going to pull apart really nicely. And in this case, as I mentioned, I have the bone in there, so you're going to see the meaning of fall off the bone tenderness. Alright guys, so after about 4.5 hours in the oven, it took a little bit longer just because I have a lot of meat here and the pieces are a little big. As I promised earlier, you can see, look at that. The meat just pulls right off the bone. So all I'm doing here is just moving the pieces over from the cooking pan into another pan. It just makes it easier to pull. You don't slosh all the sauce everywhere. And then we're actually going to keep this and cook it down. We're going to put some in it when we pack it up. We'll cook this down to make our barbecue sauce. I'll make that in another video. I don't want this one to go on too long, so I'll make the follow-up to that. But yeah, pretty much, we can just move the bone aside. Once you get your meat in there, you want to take a couple forks, or if you let the meat cool off a little bit, use your hands. And then, as the name suggests, with pulled pork, you just want to get in there and start literally pulling the meat apart. And you always want to do this shortly after taking it out of the oven. You don't want to wait for it to cool off to do this, because when it's warm, it just pulls apart a lot easier. And like I said, if you want to use your hands, wait a little bit longer for it to cool down, but you can see there how easy it is to just pull apart. So that's all you want to do for the whole thing. Just go pull all your meat apart until it gets to the consistency you want it. If you want it really thin, if you want it thicker like this, you're good. Or you can take the time and really shred it down like so. But yeah, it's just that easy. So I'm gonna go ahead, and I won't bore you guys again with pulling all this meat. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So there we go. So there's a video on how to make some pretty quick and easy, despite the cooking time, but pretty quick and easy pulled pork recipe. As I just mentioned, I will be making a barbecue sauce, but I'll make that in another video and kind of show you guys how to finish it off. But yeah, at this point, as I said, once your pork is cooked like this, go ahead, pull it all when it's warm, and then obviously if you're going to eat it right away, you can eat it, or I would recommend putting it in a Ziploc bag, or maybe if you work in a kitchen, if you have access to a vacuum sealer, put it in the bag, vacuum seal it. If you put it pretty flat and freeze it freezes well, and you can pull it out whenever you want it again for the next time. And the good thing with this recipe is it's pretty basic. As I said, I went with kind of the smoky sweet flavor that you get with the Coke and the Pepsi, and then the smoky flavor from the smoked dry rub that I used. You can play around with your flavors. Again, you can put your favorite barbecue sauce on it, or you can just have it like this. If you just kind of leave some of this juice, let it soak in, that works really nicely as well. But yeah, I'm not going to ramble on for too much longer, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Remember to subscribe to the channel. I got more videos coming on the line really soon, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.